The role of the press in a democracy is to inform the public about issues in the government and in society truthfully. But this duty often clashes with government actions that restrict the press from fulfilling this role. The freedom of the press is promised by the First Amendment, which states, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press." The First Amendment has protected the press since the founding of our country, even as a majority of presidents have heavily criticized journalists going against this amendment. The 1917 Espionage Act is also important to the current debate over press freedom. This act was passed during World War I with the goal of protecting government secrets and imprisoning any violators. In the 1915 State of the Union address, Woodrow Wilson stated, "Such creatures of passion, disloyalty, and anarchy must be crushed out. They have formed plots to destroy property. They have entered into conspiracies against the neutrality of the government. They have sought to pry into every confidential transaction of the government in order to serve interests alien to our own. While it has prosecuted many government leakers such as Julius and Ethel Rosenberg during World War II, it has also been interpreted to prosecute journalists." The release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, which contained secret government documents about the Vietnam War, stirred debate over the press's freedom. Daniel Ellsberg was a government analyst and released the documents in the hope of ending the Vietnam War, which he saw was taking many lives. He was charged under the Espionage Act, but government threats toward him caused the judge to dismiss all charges. So the government threatened the press instead. During this affair, Nixon told the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the press is your enemy. Enemies, understand that? Because they're trying to stick the knife right in our groin. After the Vietnam Papers were published by many popular newspapers, including the New York Times, Nixon believed they had placed themselves above the law and challenged their publishment in court. He suspended all the newspapers that were publishing the Pentagon Papers, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the press, citing the First Amendment. Nixon was the first president to attempt to charge the press under the Espionage Act, and this issue has resurfaced with the WikiLeaks scandal. In 2010, Julian Assange, an Australian computer programmer, published a multitude of government documents on his site, WikiLeaks. He had worked with the New York Times, The Guardian, and other international newspapers to redact the documents and classify them into different categories such as a war. The documents were leaked by a former soldier, Chelsea Manning. In 2013, she was sentenced under the Espionage Act, but had her sentence commuted by President Obama in 2017 and was released. Recently, Chelsea Manning was called into court to testify on the case of Julian Assange. After Manning refused to provide any information, she was jailed for 2 months, and she will continue to refuse any subpoenas by the court. Julian Assange has spent the last 7 years hiding in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. He told Ecuador that he fears he will be extradited to the United States for publishing illegal documents, so he was granted asylum. Assange's asylum was recalled on April 11th, and he was arrested by the authorities. In May, the United States charged him under the Espionage Act while he was serving time in England for breaching the Bail Act. In this case, the use of the Espionage Act against Assange is interesting. Assange claims that he is a journalist, even if his approach is different from the traditional articles we read. While many journalists have disagreed with Assange on his title because he only publishes the raw document, the job of a journalist has never been defined, so Assange's claims are genuine.
Ecuador has stopped protecting Assange. He's facing Aunt Becky levels of prison time. Although a lot of people are concerned that by arresting Assange, the government is creating a precedent to lock up journalists who expose government secrets in the future.
By charging Assange with the Espionage Act, the government is claiming that it has the power to control the press, which it doesn't, according to the First Amendment. Bill Keller, the former editor of the New York Times, describes the relationship between the press and the government by saying, "The intentions of our founders have rarely been as well articulated as they were by Justice Hugo Black 40 years ago, concurring with the Supreme Court ruling that stopped the government from suppressing the secret Vietnam War history called the Pentagon Papers. The government's power to censor the press was abolished so that the press would remain forever free to censor the government. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of the government and inform the people." This debate has blurred the lines between criminal and journalist. While the actions of Ellsberg and Manning were illegal, WikiLeaks and the newspapers that publish the illegal documents are also being charged under the Espionage Act. In my opinion, this violates the First Amendment. Matthew Miller, the director of the Department of Justice during Obama's administration, believes that the use of the Espionage Act is essential to prevent leaking.
If you look the other way, then you only encourage other people to leak national security secrets. You do have to show that there are consequences for leaking information that could harm national security. And the only way to do that is to prosecute some of the individuals responsible for the most egregious leaks. There are secrets that need to remain secret.
Miller is mainly referring to government leakers, but his argument is similar to many politicians, including past and present presidents. Nixon's main point in the case, considering the Pentagon Papers, was that journalism was a threat to our national security. There is reason for censorship as well. Assange, for example, did publish many unredacted documents that left people in danger. While national security is necessary, what if the muckrakers of the early 20th century weren't allowed to publish their books exposing big businesses? Or if journalists weren't allowed to report on the Watergate scandal? Or reveal information that led to the end of the Vietnam War, saving countless lives? Since government regulations restrict the press, journalists must instead be held to an ethical code. The goal of the New York Times is to cover the news as impartially as possible, without fear or favor, in the words of Adolf Ochs, our patriarch, and to treat readers, news sources, advertisers, and others fairly and openly, and to be seen to be doing so. While this may be one newspaper, it is also one of the most well-known in the world. Assange didn't follow this ethical code, and it is impossible to enforce. But we must trust that truthful journalism will always overwhelm the falsities.
The dishonest media, which has published one false story after another, with no sources, even though they pretend they have them, they make them up in many cases. They just don't want to report the truth, and they've been calling us wrong now for 2 years. They don't get it, but they're starting to get it, I can tell you.
If we do begin to criminalize the press, there will be huge consequences. The surge of fake news accusations, especially by our president, have already damaged the freedom of the press. Donald Trump said in a tweet, "I just cannot state strongly enough how totally dishonest much of the media is. Truth doesn't matter to them. They only have their hatred and agenda. This includes fake books, which come out about me all the time, always anonymous sources, and are pure fiction. Enemy of the people." Journalists must have the freedom to publish information that informs the American people, even if it hurts the government. A Washington Post journalist even said, "If there are no protections for engaging in an ethical relationship between journalist and source, why bother blowing the whistle in the first place?" The use of the Espionage Act towards the press will mean the reporting on government secrets will come to a halt. Another consequence of government criticism is the increased violence toward journalists. Sasha Ingber reports that 10 journalists have been physically attacked this year and 46 since 2017. In January, one reporter was punched in the face and her phone stolen while interviewing voters in California. Last June, 5 people were killed while working at the Capital Gazette newsroom in Annapolis, Maryland. The man accused of shooting them had threatened the publication for years leading up to the attack. As we attempt to define journalism, the press is being attacked. Fake news labels don't only discredit the news source, they put their journalist in a place of danger. In order to embrace a free press, the government cannot restrict journalists using the Espionage Act or any other media regulation. We must trust that ethical journalism will prevail. The United States now ranks 48th in the World Press Freedom Index, even though America is the land of the free. Our actions also set a precedent for other nations, and now only 24% of the 180 countries in the index are considered safe for the press. The role of the press is to inform the people, and government regulations prevent this from happening. This has caused many journalists to ask themselves the same question. If the law doesn't protect journalists, why report in the first place?